not a good scene. All right, well, let's get started.
Okay.
We are in Abilene, Texas, at the Southwest Chapter reunion. This is Carol Bland. My name's Michelle Colvin. It is October 31st, and let's get started. Let me just get started by asking you a little bit about your where you were born and raised, and a little bit about your education.
Okay, some of this might sound unbelievable to your generation. I was born and raised in Putnam County, Missouri, on a little 120-acre hill farm where in fact, my parents, neither one worked outside the home and raised 6 children on that farm. I walked to grade school, about 1.5 miles when we cut through from the time I first started to school until I graduated from there. And then we had a consolidated grade school and high school at Martinstown, Missouri. That was 3 miles from our house. And I went there 3 years of high school. Rode horseback if I didn't walk. I rode horseback, and a merchant in this little town had a barn behind his store, and we kept our horses there during the school day and then rode back home. The last year of high school, we still had to get to Martinstown, but from Martinstown to Unionville, we rode the school bus, which was about 15 miles. So that was my primary education in Missouri. I grew up on the farm. My parents didn't have an automobile until I was in second year of high school. My dad finally traded for a used 1931 Model A Ford, and I got to use it on dates. That was pretty great back then. But we had no electricity, no running water. Some of the neighbors had battery-operated radios, but we didn't. We had no telephone. We grew up kind of like the Mennonites live today. That's about the way our lifestyle was. Then after I got out of high school, I went to Waterloo, Iowa, and got a job up there at Rath Packing Company. I married a local girl before I came into the service. And then I was drafted. And 4 months after I got into service, my oldest son, Roger, was born. And then I had a daughter that was 1 year and 1 day older than him, but was born just before we had to go overseas. And after I came back from the service, I went to school at what is now Iowa State University. It was a teacher's college at that time. And I earned a teacher's certificate, but I never used it. I was offered a job, but I would have had to move, and it paid back then the annual salary of $3,000 a year. And but I got an opportunity to go to work for a radio station, KWWL Radio in Waterloo, Iowa, and for more money. So that's what I did, and I never did teach school. After the war, I'd like to mention this. I don't think any normal person can go into battle, go into war, and see battle, and come home psychologically balanced. It just doesn't happen. And I think that all veterans of war should have some psychological help when they first come back. I had a bad time settling down. I'd get a job and I could maybe work at it for 3 or 4 years. And when the challenge was gone, I had to move to something else. And I've held a lot of jobs and I can do a lot of things. But I think, I know that I had a real problem at first. And of course you try to overcome those things by yourself. And I think that was part of it, was my war experience. I had nightmares until, I would say into the early 70s before I finally quit having those things. And the war affected my life a lot. You know, it put all my dreams on hold, and then when I got out, you know, you go in. I was raised in a, as I told you, on a farm, in a Christian home, with Christian values. Then I'm drafted into the service, and we learn to do things that you know, that don't comply with those values. And we learned, we had good training of 12th Armored Division. We had a really good training. But even with that training, when you first go into battle, that's the most unnatural thing. It's hard to do. The only way I can make myself kill another human being was because I knew if I didn't, it would be me. And I was determined to get back to my kids and my wife. And but after a while, you know, you get conditioned. And I can remember I got where I didn't feel comfortable unless I was up where the action was. But then you come back home and you got to readjust again. And that's hard because in the service, we talked rough. We did all kinds of things, you know, that way. I don't think I would have ever done otherwise. And I think part of that is because we have to prove ourselves to be macho, you know, and to be tough. And we're trying to support each other. And we're drinking because we have a lot of problems with what we have to do, you know. So that's something that I think everyone should know and be aware of. And I think the government should help when they come out, always. Give them that psychological help that they need. But I got to say, too, that in spite of all of that, if I had it to do over, I'd go back, you know. If I was called again to do those things, I would do it. And we were lucky during World War II. Patriotism was high. The home front supported us. Man, we got support from the home front. And almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone that I knew was, you know, they were glad to serve their country. They wanted to serve their country. And I don't think patriotism has been as high since. I don't know if it was before that time or not, but since then I haven't seen it. But those are some of the facts. War is ugly, and I think it should be prevented at all costs. But, you know, we have a lot in this country to protect, a lot to be proud of, and if when the time comes, I think every young man should want to support and help his country.
Why don't we go back a little bit to the beginning? Do you remember when the bombing in Pearl Harbor occurred?
Oh, yes.
What were you doing?
I was in Waterloo at that time, and I was just there. Had just come up there to live with my aunt and uncle, and I was trying to get work at Rathbeck and Company. I don't think I had a job with them yet. I was working for a furnace company, and I'd met my first wife at that time, and her brother. He was wanting to get into the service anyway. He was a little bit older than me. And he and I were out riding somewhere, and we heard that on the news. And he just jumped up and down, and he said, "Now my dad's got a sign for me. I'm going into the service." And to him, that was his break to get into the service.
How old was he?
Well, he was just out of high school, maybe a part of a year or a year, I guess, approximately anyway. I don't know. I didn't go with his sister very long until we got married, and I was only 18 when I got married. I had my second child in March before I was 21 in April. And I was still a kid, except overseas we all were. We all were just kids.
So
But
how long after that were you drafted?
I was drafted in 1942, or I was called to Fort Dodge, Iowa in 1942 to take my physical. And I took my physical and passed, and they sent us home. And then I had to report for duty, I think, January 9th, 43. And then I came to Fort Knox, took my basic training at Fort Knox. And then after I got out of basic school, I went to radio school at Fort Knox. And then I joined the 12th while they were on Tennessee maneuvers.
So you didn't ever come to Abilene then?
Oh, yes.
Oh, you did?
Yes. Well, to Camp Barkley, see.
Right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
About Camp Barkley?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't remember a great deal about Camp Barkley, except that we continued our training here, and we were glad to get in out of the field. Tennessee maneuvers was no picnic, but the main thing that I remember about this area is that the civilian population here treated us really good. So many places, GIs were not treated too good. But the people in Abilene and Fort Knox, both, when we were there, treated us very good. And I had no complaints at all, but I heard about other outfits and how the civilians treated them, didn't treat them so well. But we were treated good here. And even yet today, when we come back to Abilene, I just feel like I'm really welcome down here. And people treat us really good, super good.
Good. Good. I'm glad to hear that. You deserve it. I've heard of stories where there were a lot of shenanigans going on during training, to ease the strain of learning all this and the stress of going overseas and all that. Were you ever involved in some pranks or anything that?
Pranks? Oh, I guess those things were always going on. I remember, I think it was Tennessee maneuver, someone sharpened up a big chopping axe, when we would shave each other with a chopping axe, with the bit of the axe, In fact, I had some pictures of that, but I don't know what happened to them. And, yeah, we did quite a few things. I can't recall any little incidents right now that happened to me, anyhow. Occasionally we would have a guy in the outfit that didn't like to take a bath, and would teach him what a bath was, a GI way, you know. Have you ever heard of a GI bath? Do you know what happens in one of those?
Why don't you tell us?
We take GI soap and a hard bristle scrub brush. And I can remember one guy, we gave a bath and his skin was as red as a red rose when we got through with him. And he took a bath after that. Now that was in basic training. But, oh yeah, there was always someone pulling a prank of some kind, you know, and we kidded each other around a lot. But yet, at the same time, we talked pretty serious to one another sometimes too, because that's all we had was each other, you know. And that's something else that it's hard even for me to understand the strong bond that we made. Sidney Brickell, Sylvester Lumpkin, and I, and our company commander, Captain Cobb, were all in the same tank. And I don't remember ever one time, through all the stress that we went through, that we ever said a harsh word to each other. Never. And today, that bond is still there. I mean, we're just like brothers. In fact, I imagine we're closer than a lot of brothers. But the circumstances of all the things we went through, I think, has a lot to do with that. You can work with someone in civilian life in a factory or somewhere and never get that same bond that we got working, serving with each other in the service. But you're dependent on each other, and you're there for each other at all times, even through, like I said, in basic training. We had serious talks sometimes. We talked about our dreams, what we wanted to do, and all these things that we had to put on hold, and about our wives or sweethearts that were back home, and our parents, and occasionally someone would lose a parent or a loved one, you know, and except for a brief visit home for a funeral, you know, he didn't have any time for mourning, and so we had to give him support, and those things all compiled together, I think, helped create that very strong bond between GIs.
What about you did a lot of traveling before you actually went overseas. I guess you were on the train that went to New York, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I'll have to go back again a little bit. And where I was raised in Missouri was really in the boondocks. And when I went to my third year of high school, that little high school was by a railroad track. And there was very few trains I'd ever seen. When that train went by, I was looking. I was so fascinated with that train. And until I got out of school and came to Waterloo, Iowa, I hadn't been out of two-county area, except on a couple of school trips. So traveling by train was very exciting to me. And I went in, I was a very naive country boy. I hadn't been around. I didn't, know in the world much. And I had a lot to learn. I did my growing up in the military. I can remember the most vivid memory I have of a troop train was when we where did we come to? To Texas. I don't know if it was Camp Barkley. Maybe. I don't know if we came in here on a troop train or not. But anyway, they had a band there for us, and they was playing deep in the heart of Texas. And, oh man, that was a good band. They really were whooping it up, and it really made us feel good and made us feel welcome. And I've thought of that a lot of times, about how they welcomed us when we got off the troop train. When my first son was born, I got a telegraph telling me that I had a baby boy and both the mother and son was okay. So I was in basic training yet. So I went to my company, or the commander there, and showed him the telegram, said I'd like to have a leave to go home. And he looked at the telegram and he said, what do you want to go home for? Says your mother and babies are both okay. He said, and I said, I want to go home and see my son. So he finally gave me a 3-day pass to go from Fort Knox, Kentucky to Waterloo, Iowa. And I got on a troop train, and it was so crowded that I had to stand on the platform all the way up there. And I got up there and went to the hospital. I'll never forget that picture, looking at my wife and baby son there laying side by side. I had just a few minutes to see them and visit with them. It was time to go and get back on the troop train and come home. But at least I got to go home. Many times back in those days, those trains were so crowded that you couldn't get a seat. And that particular time I stood on the platform between the cars all the way to Waterloo, Iowa. So that's all the room they had. They sold me a ticket, but they didn't have a seat for me.
What was the travel like overseas?
I'm sorry?
What was the travel like overseas?
Oh, the trains overseas. I'd ridden trains over there, and they didn't have that bump when you connected. They were very smooth riding. They had those narrow gauge rails, and I don't know. Their passenger trains were much more comfortable than ours here, much more. Again, I was in the hospital when the war ended in France, and when they shipped me back, we rode a 40 and 8. I don't know if you know what a 40 and 8 is, but I guess it originally got its name. They claimed they could, in those 40 and 8 box cars, they could haul 40 men and 8 horses. I think is the way they got that name of 40 and 8. But I rode back in that train, and we had a French engineer, and that railroad track had all been bombed out. There was rails, snarls sticking up everywhere, just curled tracks, but there was one good track through there. And that guy, I know, was going 90 miles an hour up through there, just scare you to death. But I guess he knew what he was doing. But you'd look out and see all those twisted rails, and it really scare you. And we had hitchhikers, Frenchmen would hitchhike on those things. And they'd go through those towns going at that speed, and those guys would jump off and just hit those centers and just roll, just double up on the ball. But they didn't have any transportation, and if they wanted to get from one place to another, they would do it. And I think those engineers knew they were doing that, but they sure didn't help them any. When they wanted to get off, they had to just jump and roll and go. I know some of them had to hurt themselves. I don't know how they could help it, but they wanted to go bad enough that they did it.
What do you remember about arriving in New York City or New York before you shipped out?
I don't seem to remember as much about that as some of the other people that I talked to. I did get into New York City, and a country boy like me, I was impressed, of course, with the skyline of tall buildings and all that. But I think maybe that's why I was a country boy, and I didn't venture too far. I didn't get too far away, you know. I got a chance to go back there later and spend some time visiting there, visited an Army buddy there, Sidney Brickell. And I got to know a little more about New York City then than I did just before the war. I have a lot more vivid memories about when we came back into New York City after the war. I was one of the lucky ones, I guess, because we got out on points, on a point system. And I think you got, if I remember right, you got 5 points if you were married, and then 5 points for each child. So that made, and then for, you know, for medals or battles. And so I had a little advantage, and I came home much sooner than some of the others. I was transferred from the 12th to the 7th to the 4th and come home with the 1st, which was one of the first ones that went over there. And I know I've talked to my other members of my tank crew. Well, Sidney Brickell, Lumpkin was wounded and we didn't see him. He didn't come back before the end of the war. But when my ship came in to New York Harbor, that was the most beautiful sight to see that shoreline and the cars and everything. And then a little boat came out to meet us, a USO boat. Had all kinds of victory signs and flags flying and pretty girls and a band that was really whooping it up, welcoming us home. And I don't think there was any dry eyes on that ship. Then they came aboard and they gave us fresh milk and some of those goodies that we hadn't had all the time we were over there. Really gave us a welcome home. But then later, some of the guys that went home like 6 months or a year later, they didn't get that same welcome. There was no welcoming ship there, they tell me. So that's a vivid memory in my mind. It's hard to explain how good it makes you feel to see your homeland and all the bright lights and the skyline of an American city. I'll tell you, after you were gone all that time, and we weren't there a great long time, but it seemed like forever to us. That was a beautiful sight, I'll tell you.
Well, once you landed in Europe, tell me a little bit about where you went and what happened.
I remember quite a little bit about different things and where we went and what happened, except it's hard for me to pinpoint. I have the picture of the place in my mind, but I have trouble pinpointing just where it was and at what time. And I even have sometimes I have difficulty recalling which event took place before the other, you know. So some of those things are a little fuzzy. And then I wrote a little story about an incident that involved, in my mind, we had lost 2 men, and I thought this was all in one battle. But the 2 other guys in my tank say, no, that was 2 different, one happened 2 days before the other. Now, how that got fused in my mind as being in one situation, I don't know. But sometimes I remember things that my buddies don't, and they remember things that I don't. But when both of them tell me that, as strong as this is in my mind, I know they must be right. So once in a while I get a little bit confused about the time and when they happened and that type of thing.
That's not as uncommon as you might think. So don't feel at all
Well,
intimidated by that. We just want to hear your story. So
yeah. Well, we had Sidney Brickell and I, when we was over there, we were both radio operators, but he was the chief radio operator and was assistant driver in the tank, and I was the gunner of the tank. And since we were in a company commander's tank, most of the time I was in the turret by myself. And but we had to relieve each other on this CW set. So when we'd stop for the night, we always stayed together, so we could let each other get some sleep, because we had to have that radio on all the time. And one of the things that amazes me even yet today, we could put those headsets on and go to sleep, and that stuff coming through in our ears wouldn't bother us a bit, but if our call sign come on, we woke up just like that. We trained ourselves to do that, and I still don't understand how we did it, but we sure did it. And we'd never miss our call letters if they came on. Sometimes we'd even make a remote control. I remember one time we was in a little French village, and we had a remote control run up from the tank to the upstairs in this French home, and the French people were living there, and he was with the French underground. And we had feather beds, white sheets on them, and of course we had to move. If something happened, we had to move fast. We crawled in those beds with the feather beds and the feather comforters with their boots on. But those people really liked us, and we got pushed out of that town and came back about a week later, about midnight one night, and we stopped by the same house, and when we knocked on the door and they saw us, they just cried and hugged us, and we went right back up to our room, Another time, I'm a little reluctant to tell about this, but I think this museum that Abilene Christian University is putting together for us down here is going to be an educational museum. And we've had, I'm sure, a lot of people talk about our great battles at Herlersheim and Colmar and all these different places. And there's a lot of things, everyone can tell little personal stories about each one of those things, I'm sure. And sometimes the situation of war causes you to do things that you're not particularly proud of. Maybe you just as soon not have in your record. But for a historical museum, I think it should be in the record. So I'm going to tell this little story. We were in a small village one night. It was a German village, I remember that. I can't tell you the village it was. And we had gone to a home there, close by where we stopped, because we was going to spend the night there. And we told the German family to get out. We were taking that house over for the night, which was a common practice. We did that. And so we did. Brickell and I, with our radios, and we had our guns and some hand grenades with us, because we knew we were in, probably the Germans had us surrounded. A Recon, and many times, is up ahead of the front lines, and that's our job, to find the strength of the enemy and where they're at. So, and I was a kind of person, from the time I was very young, I needed sleep. I had to have regular sleep, and when we went so long sometimes without sleep, my body just wouldn't take it anymore. I would go to sleep. I don't care how hard I tried to stay awake or what situation we was in. And we were very tired when we came in that night, and we went to sleep. And early in the morning, we heard machine gun fire, or I heard machine gun fire. I woke up, and Brickell was gone. So I hurried, picked this up. I thought, man, the Germans are coming into town, and I'm not with my unit, you know, but I was right behind him. I didn't realize that he had shook me before he left. And anyhow, we got in our tank, and here come all the other members of the 92nd that were there, too. We all got out there in a hurry with our tanks and armored cars. And it was a German infantry coming into town, firing. And, of course, they weren't a match for our armored cars and light tanks. So we were soon had them under fire, and they were on a defensive. And suddenly some German Nazi infantry from our right started coming up toward our tank with their hands up and had white flags. And we were prepared to take their weapons and take them prisoner. But before they got there, we heard machine gun fire from one of the armored cars in another unit to our left, and they shot those prisoners down. Now, that wasn't our practice to do something like that, and it gave me a really bad feeling. I had no love for the Nazi soldiers, but this was against the Geneva Convention, and I believed that, you know, we should abide by it. But later, I learned that a day or two before that, one of their armored cars had been knocked out by some SS troops, and the men were forced to surrender. And as they came out and tried to surrender, they were shot down. So these guys, with the bond I told you about, seeing their buddies, they could see it from where they were at. They made a vow that the next prisoners that tried to surrender, they would do the same to them. Well, I could understand that. And that little incident makes me no less proud of the 12th Armored Division because, but that is just one of the little things that can happen. War is a cruel thing. It's an ugly thing. And these kind of things, situations, cause some of these things that happen. We went on, continued on, and ran into some stiffer resistance with some German artillery ahead of us. And they had a hillside or hill crest zeroed in on, and we were having quite a time in that area until we got some bigger artillery that came up and relieved us. About the time they did, we took about 35 prisoners, and as we came back, we took the prisoners with us, and we had them down lined up along a road, you know, with we always call them a grader ditch, you know, sitting with their feet in the ditch and on the bank. And they all had their hands up. And you can only hold your hands up about so long, and they get heavy. They started bringing them down. Some of them got them down on their head. And one of these boys from that same troop that had a score to settle, he made them with their hands up, keep them up. If they didn't, he'd kick them right under the chin with that heavy military boot. And again, I thought, well, I understand his feelings, but really, we should treat our prisoners correctly, you know. Then that night we stayed in huge two-story building. And we had the prisoners in a big building on one side of the hall. It was like an auditorium or something it had been. And the prisoners were all put in there and locked in. And the rest of us were staying across the hall in little rooms. And again, Brickland and I were in there with our equipment. And along toward morning, we heard, "Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!" And we thought, my gosh, those prisoners are escaping, you know. So we grabbed our guns and rushed out in the hall. And we found that the interrogator had an officer, one of the Nazi officers that we had captured in the room, interrogating him. They had him sitting in a chair, and one of these kids, the same kid that was kicked in the nose and the chin, was in there with him. He had on a pair of brass knucks. You know what brass knucks are? And they'd asked this officer a question, and sometimes this interrogator would, if he didn't answer, he'd go, "Heil Hitler," not answer. The interrogator would answer the question for him, and he used this on purpose to try to make him believe that we already knew everything anyway. But the real questions we didn't know. So they kept asking him, and finally, when they'd ask a question and he'd spring up to his feet and click his heels and "Heil Hitler," this kid would hit him with the brass knucks. And he had done that so many times, his face was just bloody pulp. So finally, the Nazi officer couldn't take it anymore, and he tried to run down the steps. And of course, an escaping prisoner, you know what you do, you shoot him. So then they went down and dragged him up, put him in front of the door, put across the hall and got another prisoner. He had to step over his dead officer body. When they started asking questions, they got answers. Again, this is not the way we treat prisoners, but we were desperate for some information. And that one guy's life probably saved a lot of American lives, if not both American and German lives. So once in a while, circumstances demand, or, put you in a position where you've got to make some kind of a judgment about something like that. And these kind of things happen. I think everyone should know that these kind of things do happen. We were a good division. We did, by and large, go by all the rules of war set down by the Geneva Convention. The Nazis did not, ever. They had no loyalty to anything. Any agreement they made didn't mean anything with anyone. So I've told those stories, which are not pretty stories. But I'm no less proud of the 12th Armored Division. And I hope no one else will be, because this is just part of war. This is part of the things that happen behind the scenes and in between some of the big battles that go on.
Speaking of big battles, can you tell us anything about your experience in Hildesheim?
Yes, there again, well, while we were in Hildesheim, the longshoremen in the United States had been on strike. And I don't think for very long. I think President Roosevelt ended it. But during that time, we didn't get ammunition shipped over. And when we were at Hildesheim, Sidney Brickell and I were in a building, and the three of us was operating a CW set, a voice radio, and a telephone. And when our big artillery had a target that they wanted to fire upon, they had to call and get clearance to do it. And they would usually get 3 rounds of ammunition. because there was a shortage. And so we worked ourselves crazy round the clock, taking these calls and getting the things approved so they could fire and all this. And we finally had to, each one of us try to operate it alone so the other could get some sleep. We was there for 12 days and nights. And one night when I was sleeping on the floor, suddenly there was people running over the top of me, and it woke me up. And upon wakening, I found that a German 88 had fired on, knocked one end of the building off. With all the noise going on all the time anyway, the shelling and all that, that didn't bother me. I didn't even wake up. But the guys running over me to get, away from that end of the building, I guess, woke me up. But they never did hit the rest of the building. I think someone knocked the tank out. But I think there's a picture in one of the 12th Armored Division history books that shows a map of that area at that time and shows the building and the tank that hit it. Herlersheim was I remember the big old 105 howitzers. They were close by, and they used them to try to lob in. The Germans were dug in over there pretty well in the area we were working, and it was hard to hit. We'd have to kind of lob in on them, and we lost a lot of tanks and a lot of men. I was in a relatively safe position, but I'll never forget, just before we got relief, our dive bombers came in, and I'll never forget the picture of them flying over and diving down and dropping those bombs, and all the flak that was shot up at them. It was unbelievable that they could get through all that flak without being hit. They didn't lose one plane that I know of. But that was our baptism, really, Herlersheim, and we really we got a good one while we were there. I'll tell you, the guys that I respect more than anyone else in any army or in any division are the infantry. And those armored infantry guys were the ones that took the beating and lost a lot of men. And I was glad I was where I was. But it was rough for anybody that was there at that time.
Can you tell us a little bit about the concentration camp that you were?
Yeah, we went. The 12th Armored helped liberate 3 of those, and I think it was Landsberg. I may be mistaken, but the first one that I remember was the one that impressed me the most. And I remember coming in, driving into town, and we could see in the distance a lot of things that we weren't sure about. But as we drove in, there was a few of the Jewish prisoners that came to meet us, could barely go, some almost crawling. And I never believed that a human being could be alive and look that way. They looked like skeletons with colorless skin stretched over the bones, and their eyes set way back in their heads. And when you looked at their eyes, they weren't bright. They didn't shine. They had a look of vagueness about them. Most of them were barefooted. But some of them had shoes, and they had to stuff newspapers around their shoes to keep their bony ankles from wearing through the skin and to help keep their shoes on, I guess. And it was just unbelievable to see human beings that could still move and go. And it made you wonder how they could continue to live without trying to do something, even though it would kill them under those conditions. And we threw out K rations to them. And that was bad because they couldn't handle it. We learned that soon, and at this particular camp they had already shot a lot of prisoners. We had American prisoners there and other prisoners of war, as well as the Jewish people there in this camp. But many of them had been lined up and shot. They usually stripped them naked, lined them up, shoot them, and as they fell in, after they fell in, they'd cover them up with dirt. It didn't make any difference whether they killed them when they shot them or not, as long as they fell in a trench. That was it. And they had tried to get some out on a train, and they didn't have time, so they riddled that with machine gun fire, and possibly that's where some of these people that met us came from, some that survived that. I remember we dug up, we saw a hand move, sticking out of the dirt. And we dug it up, and it was a Russian prisoner of war. And he was still alive. He wasn't injured that bad, but he had been under that dirt so long that he couldn't hardly move his joints. But I think they survived. I think they saved him. They had him, when I saw him last, he was sitting in a chair, and he had taken some nourishment, and I think perhaps he survived. But, of course, many of them had been driven into what they were told was the showers and gassed, and thrown into the furnace and burned, and they'd been tortured and used for guinea pigs, and it was just almost impossible for me to believe, even when you saw it with your own eyes, that any human being could do something like that to another human being. And Hitler originally had a good mind. He had he built a terrific army. He pulled some fantastic things, but because of his prejudice against these Jews, he just went crazy with some of this stuff. And that's what lost the war for him, I think, more than anything else. But it was terrible. There's no way. I've seen but about one picture that showed it as bad as it is. It's hard for anybody to know that didn't see it, how bad that was. And here during the last couple of years, they had the 50th anniversary of the Holocaust. And we had people in this country, and in Europe too especially, saying, nah, that didn't happen. Or it was exaggerated, that was just way exaggerated. I want to tell you, it happened. I saw it with my eyes. I smelled the death. I felt the pain. It was just overwhelming when you saw that. It happened, and we should never forget it. And we need to know that it happened, because that kind of thing is happening today in some of these third world countries. The same, almost as bad. Ethnic cleansing, they call it, and different things. And it could happen in this country. We have right now a situation where we're disgusted with politics and we're wanting changes, and if the right man came along here, Hitler was a great orator. He could really lay it on. And he had those people, when he was first made president, 40 million people voted for him over there. After the war, a lot of the older German people were, they wanted him out. They knew they had made a mistake, but it was too late. But during that 35 that we captured that I told you were prisoners, we had a kid in there that was born and raised in Chicago. And he could talk English just like we did. He had been over there, he had gone over there when he was about 10. His parents went back to Germany. And he had went to school there, and he was a Hitler Youth. He was worse than any of them. He hated the Americans worse than anyone. But those kids were so brainwashed, they didn't know any better. But the older German people did. But they got into that trap. They voted for him at a time when they were just coming out of World War I. They just survived a depression like we did here. That was a worldwide depression. And then Germany was, they felt guilty about World War I. They were kind of blamed for it, and they lost the war. So Hitler gave them a lot of promises and a lot of things to look forward to. That really did help them for a while until he went so mad and thought he was going to capture the whole world, But we need to look at history and remember these things and learn about them so they're not repeated. We were involved in clearing out the Colmar pocket. And we were tasked with the 1st French Army or Division, whatever it was. And we had French Moroccans that we fought with. Crazy kind of people. They were fighting people, but they did everything different than we did. And even their wives would follow them and come in at night sometimes when, And I remember before we went into Colmar, made the push in, we all stopped and whitewashed our tanks and armored cars in a little village. I don't know how far from Colmar it was, but not very far. And while we were doing that, the French came out with red wine. Pretty French girls would bring out wine for us, and some of the guys even dumped their 5-gallon water cans and filled it with wine, and while we whitewashed the tanks, we were drinking this wine out of our big old canteen cups. Oh, it was smooth stuff, it tastes good. By the time we left to go to Colmar, I don't think there was one guy that wasn't inebriated, a little bit at least. And I know I was. And these French Moroccans, they were just like a bunch of Indians when they went into battle. And we did the same thing. We went through a little minefield. It was an anti-personnel mine more than an anti-tank minefield, so it didn't bother us too much. But we went through that thing. I think every horn, every siren, and guns are blazing, and guys are yelling just like the French Moroccans. I think we scared them out of Colmar. I think when they saw us coming, they thought, what a crazy outfit, get out of here. But there was some resistance, and some of the guys ran into more of it than we did. I saw Nazis at a machine gun emplacement. They see us coming, and they didn't even try to fire. They grabbed up they didn't even grab their gun. They just left. They left the thing. And that was the craziest thing I ever went through. Then we we had a little battle we got into one time which we shouldn't have. Recon is supposed to not fire upon the enemy unless fired upon. We're supposed to be out there looking for the enemy and finding out their strength or putting up a screen on the flank or something. But one time we stopped for a little rest period, not long before night, and I think our kitchen truck came up. I know it did. And someone had saw a Nazi soldier digging in up on the hill. And anyway, we got involved in a battle up there and lost our tank. And that's when our driver, we had to abandon our tank. We got up there and our tank driver shut the tank off. And when we got up there, we found so many more than we thought we would. There was only three. There was, I think, 2 tanks and an armored car that went up there. And we got a lot of the people in the trenches. They came out and surrendered. But there was also German 88 back there. And the other 2 vehicles got, one up had to withdraw with the prisoners, and the other one got knocked out. And when we went to start our tank, we had to get away from there. We was going to get hit. Couldn't get it started. Nothing we could do start that vehicle. So Captain Codd advised us to abandon the tank, and so we had to get out. And they were shooting small arms fire at us, and then they shot mortars as we ran to the back. And that's when Sylvester Lumpkin got hit. A mortar shrapnel hit him. Later, when they found him in the hospital, they found also he had a handgun bullet in him, in his chest. And I think he got that when he was getting out of the tank. He didn't even know it. He ran that far and then he got hit. So we lost our tank. And then later the tank recovery went back there and some heavier equipment went up. We got our tank back. So our old company sergeant decided he would drive the tank. We didn't have a driver anymore. He kind of bragged about, let's see, he was a good tank driver. And anyhow, we was going up this hill, making a curve to the right, with our lights out, just following little cat eyes, we called them, because there was a lot of snipers and we didn't know what else in the area. And as we come up around that curve to the right, Sergeant Jensen didn't follow the cat eyes and went over a cliff. And we was hitting treetops all the way down, saying prayers as we went. And we landed with the nose of that thing right in a big shell crater down there. And no one thought we'd survive, but we before they left, we let them know we did and got out of there. And we had to get out and get in a half track and went on, and we left all of our everything was in the tank. We didn't have any clean clothes, no nothing. Supplies were way behind us. And then a few nights later, we had to hold a line just in case the Germans came through. We knew that if they did, we had an awful thin line to defend them, but I had to get down in the trench to help hold this line. And we didn't have any Germans come through, but I froze my feet. And of course I didn't have any, as I said, we didn't have any change of clothing. And my blisters come on my feet and broke, and my socks got wet, and it was cold, and there was no change. I didn't have to change the socks. So they really got bad, and I had to go back to the hospital. And they told me there that I had jungle rot on my feet, which is something you only get in the Pacific, I thought. But anyway, I was in the hospital and then back to a rehabilitation hospital and the war ended while I was back there. And then when I got back to the outfit, wasn't long until Truman, who was president at that time, made a decision, a bigger decision, but like I was talking about, sometimes you have to make a decision. And he made the decision to drop that hydrogen or atomic bomb. Killed a lot of people, a lot of innocent people, men, children, and everything, but it ended the war. It saved a lot of American, thousands and thousands of lives that it saved. So that's what I mean. War is so ugly. And these are some of the things sometimes that you do that you don't like to do, you don't want to do, but the circumstances sometimes dictate that you do these things, and it makes things better than it would be otherwise.
So how did you serve your occupation?
Pardon?
How did you serve in occupation?
I didn't.
Oh, you didn't have anything?
No, when I got back from the hospital, we were at Texas, Germany, and we had new tanks with 75 millimeters on them, instead of those little 37s that we'd had all through the war. Now, too late to do us any good there, but they thought we were going to Japan. But as soon as that war ended over there, they started moving them out on this point system I told you about, and I had a lot of points. I went for just a little while to division trains and worked in the ration breakdown. I was in charge of that for a while. But then, because of my points, I went back to another outfit that was going home sooner, and then from it to another one before I came home. And I got home, I was discharged in October 22nd, 1945. Many of them didn't get out until almost a year after that. So I wasn't over there in the occupation. And I was so glad to get home. I didn't put any claims in for my feet. You would have had to got out of line and stayed here another few weeks, and I thought my feet will be all right. I went home and I suffered with them for years. After that, I was hospitalized once on crutches because they kept flaring up a little bit. But eventually, I found medication that would control it. And so all those years, I saved the government a little bit of money just because I wanted to get home to my family, I guess.
That's understandable.
You know. But I'll tell you, I think World War II was an honorable war. It was one I was really proud to serve in. Even though I had all these dreams and I had a family started and I loved my little baby so much, I still felt like I had to go. I had to help with my country. And I'm proud that I did. And I'm proud of the 12th Armored Division, really proud of it. And the 92nd Recon, we had our part to play. Each unit did. And each did their job very well, I think. And so I think we can lift our heads anytime anyone mentions the 12th Armored Division and be really proud that we served in it. And like I say, in spite of all the heartaches and all the things that you go through afterward, if I had to do over again, I'd do the same thing. There'd be no question about it. And out here, I've got some of the best friends, some of the closest buddies that anyone could ever hope to have because of that war. And we all went through the same thing. We understand each other. And it's just great to get together. And I know every year when I come to these and I see so far, all of my tank crew still living. But every time I see them and have to tell them goodbye, you don't know if you're ever going to see them again. It might be me, it might be one of them, because we're getting at that age where we're just, we never know. But I appreciate having this interview and telling a little bit. I hope that someone who looks at this video will understand a little bit more about it, and maybe it will help them make decisions in their generation. And especially, I hope they understand that it's important at all costs to avoid war if possible. But if it has to happen, it's an ugly thing, but get in there and do your part, because it's worth it for this country we live in.
Well, you were great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Amy, did you have any questions for him?
No, you covered everything I wanted to.
Great.
Okay, my voice was terrible. I couldn't help it. It just started getting hoarse on me. And